you got to borrow $7 trillion in the world, more than what's available, what do you think is going to happen to interest rates? What's going to happen? Well, they're going to rise. So we're going to be faced with one of the following two dilemmas unless Congress gets its act together. And here's the two dilemmas. The first is our average interest cost goes back to its historical cost. If that happens, immediately we're going to see $640 billion more a year in interest cost. 640. We only had 200 billion, less than 200 billion this year. We're going to see 640 billion increase. That doesn't help any person that has a need. All that does is that's paid out to our debtors. That's a very real risk for us right now. That goes to say that we don't have a lot of time, because what we know is interest rates are going to rise. So it's mandatory that Congress do what the American people have known for a while we need to do. And that's live within our means. Now, let me describe the second problem, or a second solution, and that's what the Federal Reserve will do. The Federal Reserve will just print more money. Well, if you print more money and you don't have any base for doing that, that creates what's called inflation. It's called debasing your currency. What happens in America if we decide that the way we're going to get out of our problem is to debase our currency and print more money, like the Fed is doing right now with what's called quantitative easing 2. They're printing $600 billion worth of money between now and June. Well, what happens is the value of everything you own in real terms declines. In nominal dollars goes up, but the purchasing power of the average middle-class family in this country declines tragically. And the safety net that this country has been known for those that are far less fortunate than the average American, will be absolutely unaffordable. Totally unaffordable. So you're talking about the destruction of the best of America, our middle class. You're talking about taking opportunities away. So what's the answer? The answer is not to have more partisan statements by Senator Merkley, impugning the motives of people who were trying to do right things, even though different from his opinion. The answer is for Congress to get together and recognize the threat to our future and give up long-held positions to solve the greater good. That means you have to move. That means you have to recognize that you can't have it all your way. How do you actually do that? Well, the one failure of Congress in my time in Congress, both in the House in the mid-90s and now in the Senate since 2004, is we don't do oversight. How did we end up with this report that shows $100 billion in duplications? The only way it could have happened is we weren't watching. We weren't doing the oversight. So one of the things that needs to happen is the chairman of every committee ought to spend 90% of their time oversight things we're already doing rather than working on creating new bills and new programs. And the second thing that ought to happen is we ought to have a vigorous debate with amendments on the floor of the U.S. Senate to solve some of the very real problems we have. It's not all that hard to solve these problems, but what happens is in partisan bodies, people talk past one another. Nobody would decline the fact that we ought to get rid of unused property. We can save $8 billion a year if we get rid of the unused federal property. Anybody disagree with that? But we haven't done it. There's $8 billion. We're going to get out of this $1.6 trillion hole a couple of $1 billion at a time. And so we ought to do that. We ought to get rid of the wasteful printing at the government printing office. Save several $100 million over the next 10 years. We ought to quit paying contractors who don't do their job bonuses, and we have documented that multiple agencies are doing that on performance bonuses when they don't meet the performance requirements. We ought to collect the unpaid taxes from federal employees. It's $3 billion. And these are the settled claims. These aren't the unsettled claims.
Chair notifies the senator he has 10 minutes remaining.
Thank you. Here's a list of ideas that comes to $380 billion of things that we would, as normal Americans sitting at our family table, said, you're in trouble. 40% of your budget you're spending, you don't have the money for. Your credit cards are maxed out. You can't do it. What can we send? Here it is. 72 amendments last year. 2 of them passed the Senate. I heard the senator from Nebraska talk about some pain that might occur in his district. I want to tell you, there has to be shared pain all across the country if we're going to get out of the problems that we're in. We can no longer kick the can down the road without spilling the soup all over our kids. The time for action is now. The time for leadership is now. If you look at history, what you find is the average age of a republic is 207 years. All republics before us have failed. How have they failed? What is the thing that caused them to lose their autonomy and their freedom? Was it an invading army? Was it some natural disaster? None of those things. You go back in history, everyone that has failed over fiscal issues, the very issues that confront us today. I think it's time America cheats history. I think it's time we come together and we solve these big problems. It's going to be painful for everyone. It means some senators are going to lose their seats if they do the best right thing for America. There can't be a greater calling than that, to do the best right thing for our country. It means following a pattern of leadership that says personal sacrifice by me in a leadership position has to come first, demonstrating my ability to understand what the problem is. So we're going to have a limited debate on 2 bills, both imperfect, but certainly one of them goes more towards the problem that we have than the other. We're going to spend $3.8 trillion this year through the September 30th. The deficit's going to be $1.6 trillion. The savings from the House cuts, this little bitty green line down here, it's only $57 billion. The savings from Inouye is 4.7. You can't even see the line. It doesn't begin to address the duplication, the waste, the fraud, the abuse, the incompetence of what we have created in the federal government. It won't solve our problems. It'll be a nice starting point for partisan debate, but it takes us away what we need to really do. Here's the cut. Here's the deficit. This is in a pie chart showing it's nothing. $57 billion is nothing. What we have to do to be able to compete in the world financial market is send a signal that we get what the problem is. We're willing to make the difficult and tough sacrifices and choices to become viable and reliable and having people loan us money in the future. We have to extend the term period of our debt to where we buy the time to make these things possible so that the least amount of pain, although very real, comes about. And for goodness sakes, we've got to stop spending money we don't have on things we don't absolutely need. And I yield the remainder of my time to the senator from Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank my colleague.
Recognized.
Mr. President, as Congress tries to get serious about